welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Unfounded podcast, but more specifically, another episode of Take Me to Church. I believe this is volume 9, and we're going to be covering, at the very least, chapter 15 of Genesis. If you've been following along with us for the last 9 weeks or so, thank you very much. It's been quite the journey already, but it's going to be a very long one after this. We're going to keep going for quite a while. It's probably going to take us, I was just talking with my parents about it the other day, it's probably going to take us a couple of years at least to get through the entire Bible. So that being said, we have a lot to get through. I'm not going to get too bogged down today in kind of recapping what we've been through. Like I've said before in the last couple episodes, if you're interested in what we've been covering so far, I highly recommend you go to volume 1 of this series. It's the most recent series that I've done with the podcast, so it should be pretty easy to find. It's only, 8 episodes back now, right? Go check those first ones out first, because Genesis is a very important book. Obviously, most people realize that, but it's deeper than people realize, and we've uncovered that over those last 8 episodes or so, and I don't want to spend too much time in every episode recapping what we've been through. As I've recognized listening back, I've been doing that. So I'd like to spend the majority of the hour that we have here today covering the book, covering the Bible, right? Covering whatever other relevant pieces of information we come across, right? So I hope you enjoyed the video podcast last week. Apologies for not being out early last week, but hopefully I'll get it out this week early. I'm just trying to improve the production of the podcast and see what version of it I like best. So enjoy the experimentation over the next couple of weeks as you see me trying different methods of making videos, and audio, obviously, for those of you only listening. But that being said, we have been covering, I'll at least cover what we've talked about last week a little bit. So any of you that have been kind of contemplating that episode last week, I'm still kind of torn on it, and maybe a little bit later in the show, we'll try to find a couple of the videos that I've seen on TikTok from a Joe Rogan episode recently, just this last week. There was a gentleman that was talking about a lot of the same things we're talking about, which is kind of weird for me to listen to. But it was almost like he was commenting on some of the questions I had this last week over whether I was going the right direction with the way I was interpreting Abram's story. And I got some encouragement in that, listening to that podcast, and in some areas where I think maybe I should relook or kind of take my ideas with a grain of salt, as you should as a listener, right? I am by no means an expert in this, but I do pride myself in educating myself in these areas, right? So, and this is part of the process you're watching right now, and I'm trying to share with you so that we all kind of have a passion and some excitement for learning again, right? So that being said, we were on chapter 14 last week, and it's a little bit complicated because Abram in chapter 13, when he's introduced, has this whole thing that goes on with the Pharaoh and Sarai and Egypt. And I kind of suggested last week that there was possibly another motivation, that Abram could have been hiding, maybe even to himself, why he was doing what he was doing, why he was convincing Sarai to act like his sister. And the conclusion I came to was that the reason that the Bible very specifically leaves in that part about Abram leaving with gold and silver and camels on asses and all these things, right? Let's take a look here, because I have a better view for you guys today, so I hope you enjoy it, because you can follow along with me now, and that's something I've been wanting to get going here for a while. Let's see if we can find the part here in Genesis where it talks about Abram leaving Egypt, right? And what he has with him. Chapter 13, the very beginning, right down here. Right, it says, "And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, and in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning. So he goes back to the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, I think, or Hal. So this is very important because, and this is one thing I learned in that episode I was listening to, that Rogan episode. We'll find the gentleman's name here later in the show. But they were talking about how nothing in the Bible is kind of, it's been like 60 different authors over thousands of years, right? Nothing that is in the Bible is there for no reason. Not like a syllable, right? And this is kind of hard to understand, in our modern context, because we don't really have any works to compare. There's no other work like the Bible that's this in depth, right? But I believe that the reason that you see Abram at the beginning of chapter 13 walking out of Egypt with all of these riches is because he, in some ways, had an intention to get those things when he came into Egypt. Now, whether that's why he did what he did with Sarai, or whether that was more of like a secondary motivation that he maybe wasn't even consciously aware of, that was something going on there, right? So, nevertheless, I found it revealing that when we go forward in chapter 14, we come to kind of the confrontation of Lot and Abram. And it's not really presented as a confrontation, but when you really read it, it is a confrontation. And you kind of have to set it up with like the figures' roles properly, kind of associated with them as well, right? So Lot is the nephew of Abram, and he's coming to Abram saying, hey, I think we need to separate. And Abram's at a defeated place in his life, right? He's just been kind of shamed out of Egypt. And everybody that's with him would know that to some degree, even if they don't know why. So that Abram kind of has this downtrodden nature at that point in time that it seems Lot may have taken advantage of to some degree. Because in the story, on the surface, it appears as if Abram, when offered to kind of take his pick of the land in front of them, you want to go to the left or the right, whichever side's greener, right? Abram tells Lot, like, no, I'll go whichever way you don't go, right? So you pick first, essentially. And that can be just like a altruistic thing that Abram's doing there, but I argued last week that there's, because of the earlier motivation we uncovered, partially another one at play there, that being that, Abram is disillusioned with what he's done to the world. And when I say the world, I mean he just witnessed the ramifications of his sin in the world. So he watched how seriously God is taking the covenant he's made with Abram, right? And God has demonstrated that through this last little speed bump in his life, but that speed bump kind of affected all of Egypt and a pharaoh, right? So it put into context not only for Abram, but also for Sarai, like, this is serious. I'm taking your guys' relationship very seriously, so please take it just as seriously as I am. And this is something that's for all of us, right? Like, this is the way that Spirit works with you, God, the universe, whatever you want to call it, but there's like a relationship there that's innate. It's similar to like a parent, right? That just wants to have the relationship, but more so values it so much that it won't break its word to you when it's making a covenant, and it's being demonstrated here in this chapter for us, right? So, moving forward, you have Abram and Lot split. You have Lot go kind of towards the direction of Sodom, and he casts his tent towards Sodom. Abram goes off on another mountain, kind of near in the desert somewhere. He's somewhat wandering for a while, still in not the best place himself. And then Lot comes to Abram, or excuse me, not Lot, but like an emissary, somebody that he knows from the Sodom area, kind of telling Abram that Sodom's been invaded by this massive army that's been put together over the last couple of years, and they've killed the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they've stolen all the gold and the treasure, and they've even taken his nephew, Lot. And so it kind of depressed Abram reacts kind of surprisingly by jumping up immediately and grabbing the 300 or so people that he has with him, fighting able people with him, and runs off with kind of out any plan to go fight this huge army that's just taken out two of the most powerful city-states in the region, which is crazy, right? And doesn't make sense, again, unless you kind of color it with kind of what we were talking about earlier, reading it at a different level. Abram is going through an awakening here. And whether or not my deeper interpretation about Abram's motivations are true doesn't really matter. And that's what I've kind of realized over the last week, is that there was something deeper true. And that is that what we uncovered last week about why Abram was reacting the way he was true. That he was in this depressed state, that he was lower than low, right? Sad about what he's done in the world and up until that point, and wanting to make it a better place, wanting to make a right decision. And even though it's a small version of that confrontation with Lot is the first point in which Abram is given an opportunity to make the right choice. And he does, even though he does it kind of with what could even be interpreted as a slight amount of spite, right? Or disdain. He's still making the right choice, and he's recognizing in that moment through making the right choice that whatever he did before that was the wrong one. Whatever his motivations were, whether it was just for his self-preservation or for something deeper and more nefarious and more physical, what he left with out of Egypt represents the sin, right? And it was there as a burden to Abram to remind him of what you get when you miss the target. And that's what sin really means, right? At least in the Greek interpretation, I believe, if I'm remembering right. I think Jordan Peterson is the one I heard that from. That to sin means to miss the mark. Right? It's an archery term. So Abram missed the mark in Egypt, but he gathered the strength after Egypt and recognized what he did wrong so that he adjusted his aim the next time. And while it might have not been a bullseye with his confrontation with Lot, he hit the target. And that was something he wasn't doing before. So then he goes deeper. He recognizes what he has done well there, even if he is still depressed. And he goes off into that relationship deeper, into that relationship with God. And the desert sometimes, I believe, in this part of the Bible, is meant to represent that relationship. You know, when you venture off into the desert, you're venturing off into a place where there is no one else but you, not even food, not even water, so that the only thing that can provide for you is source, right? And you see this re-amplified deeper in the Bible as we get further on into the New Testament. You'll see this very specifically kind of come to a culmination with Jesus' temptation in the desert and the 40 days and 40 nights of fasting. Right, so there's a line through all of these stories as they build and we get higher resolution. So that brings us to this week. We are on chapter 15, and I believe I did read it last week, but it's been a while now, and my mind is kind of spaghetti this week for some reason. So before we move any further, if any of you are experiencing that kind of mental haze or confusion or kind of exhaustion, know that that's something I'm experiencing too, and it's okay, right? It's partially because I have a feeling you've been taking bites out of things you haven't attempted before. Or maybe you have attempted them before, but not in this way, right? You're approaching your life situations, and specifically obstacles, with a different type of fervor, I'm hearing, right? Energy. And there's no longer this fear built into the confrontation. As we talk about with Abram. The fear's gone, right? Even in the small confrontations, the small road bumps and speed bumps, the things that get you frazzled throughout your day, you're starting to gain a little bit of control, right? And that's what we see here embodied throughout chapter 14, is Abram grabbing the wheel a little bit and saying, hey, I do have a little bit of control here, and I recognize that what I did was wrong, and I don't want that to happen anymore, and this is how I'm going to remedy it. So he gets up and he goes and he storms off, and it's not very vivid, but he essentially defeats these armies, right? By attacking them through kind of guerrilla tactics, by dividing up the force that he has and attacking them at night and when they're not expecting it. Very effectively, right? Which is kind of fascinating because Abram, sorry, hold on one second. I do have my little Fries bookmark here. It's like a coupon for Fries that I'm using as a bookmark for the the Bible. But I figure for the camera, it's probably not the best to have as a bookmark because it doesn't look very nice. I had a cool wolf one at one point, but I don't have it anymore. Anyway, I digress. Back onto the subject. So one of the important things is that Abram succeeds in this, right? And because he succeeds, he's recognized. He started to be recognized in the world. But it only happens after he makes this extreme move, right? And I believe his name is, what is it here? The king of Salem. Excuse me. Melchizedek. So the king of Salem brought bread and wine. And then you had the new king of Chedorlaomer, or Mayor, was the king that was leading. I cannot pronounce that name. It's really hard to pronounce. You can now see it. This is how it's pronounced or spelled here, guys. Very, very hard to, if you can see it, let me make sure this is focusing properly too. It's very hard to read. Anyway, Melchizedek offers all of these rewards to basically whatever Abram wants of the physical things. And any help too, because he's a godly man. He's a priest of sorts, right? So he recognizes God as a figure or as an authority. And so he honors Abram in that way with respect. And then the new king of Sodom or Gomorrah, whichever one it is, it's Sodom, I believe, kind of tells him, nice job, essentially, but just take what you want. He's not acting overly impressed to a certain degree, but basically he's offered the same reward by two different people, one godly and one kind of more, you could think of it modern terms like atheist, right? And to both of them, Abram says, no, I'm not accepting these things. I told my God I'm not going to accept these things. Specifically, he says, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. Shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portions. So he's being generous at the same time. So he's letting the people that helped him have more and have some of the reward, but not himself. And this is now in a situation too where it's probably not going to hurt Abram to actually have a little bit of the reward. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think so. I think he'd be okay if he took a little bit of that reward, right? But because whatever his motivation was in Egypt ended up with that physical reward, and it was such a weight or a burden, I'm assuming, that's what I'm kind of seeing here, he decides, I'm not going to take this reward. So he's recognizing the connection between the physical rewards of this world and I guess we could call it the spirit of Cain, right? Because as he makes that choice, that divergence off of that road, you have Lot, who is also his bloodline, go in places, tend towards Sodom and have all those negative things happen. And then as we read on, as we get closer to Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction story, we'll see what happens to Lot and his family, right? Among other things. But Lot ends up having a series of not very fortunate events. And I am going to venture or postulate here before we get into those sections of the Bible that the reason for that is because he has chosen to allow the spirit of Cain into his house. When I say house, I mean his body, his mind. So whatever happened there in the story between Abram and Lot in the confrontation, and we don't know what it was exactly, but part of Lot's motivation was not good. Why? Because of his actions immediately afterwards. You see Judge the tree by its fruit, right? This is a quote from Jesus in the New Testament, right? Essentially, it's a paraphrase. But watch what people create, right? What they make in the world, and then judge them based on those things that they're making, because they may say something else. They may say they want one thing and then end up with another, right? Kind of like Abram. So that's where we left off with those last lines I just kind of read, right, in chapter 14. But we're going to move on to chapter 15 and see what we have this week. Hope you're enjoying the new kind of view and everything, guys. For those of you that are listening, I hope the audio is sounding as good as ever. All right, we are in Genesis 15, page 19. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and said, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And this rings familiar, I believe, has been said before already, if I'm not mistaken, to Noah, if not exactly those words, in a similar phrase. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit. And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said unto him, Take me an heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another. But the birds divided he not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcass, Abram drove them away. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet fulfilled. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. And the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Cadmonites, and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Rephaims, and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites. And that's the end of chapter 15 there. So it's interesting, right? We see a different version of Abram here. Each one of these conversations, you see in chapter 15, we're getting a higher resolution of the conversations that Abram is having with God, right? In this one, Abram is expressing a frustration, right? Now, one of the things that you don't see in chapter 14 very much at all is Abram expressing any kind of disdain outwardly towards God, complaining, really, right? Most of it is coming in kind of the unsaid way, in more of a attitude way, right? But here you see not only Abram's kind of frustration being revealed. I think partially one of the things that we as modern human beings can relate to, can reach back through history and relate to this human being through, is kind of the frustration of the awakening experience, or of trying to know God, or of trying to develop the idea of prayer, or whatever your version of it is, meditation, right? There's a reaching that it feels like you're trying to grab something that you can't grasp, that isn't tangible, that you'll do, and that produces a certain frustration. You do it for a long time, and it's for a purpose, right? Because it's trying to enunciate in a sort of photo-negative way what you could say God is, right? Or what the deity is. But it's an idea that's too big to put in a word or even an outline, right? So it has to be kind of described this way. And it's very frustrating. And part of the way that also happens is your life, your purpose is also unfolds in that way. And so partially what's happening here is God's having to reiterate to Abram, hey, I've told you that your seed will be vastly numbered, right? And he's had, like I said, not as specific conversations, but similar conversations to this with Abram in the past, right? So this is something that Abram's bringing back up. And again, I think this is a place that we can really relate as the modern human being to Abram, because I think when we pray, there's usually like one thing that when you're breaking down, you'll go to, right? That'll be like the thing you keep on asking God why for, whatever that why question comes around for. This was his, and Abram's why was, why don't I have a child yet? And very specifically because the promise that God is making entails a child. While God has never said, I'm going to give you a child on this day and you'll have this specific amount, he's in general saying you're going to have plenty of children. Your family's going to number the generations, right? So don't worry about it at this point in your life. And this is, again, a way that we can interpret it, some of the messages that come through for each of us individually about being patient, about everything happens when it's supposed to, essentially. This is a version of it for Abram, but that he's breaking down and saying, God, I am tired of waiting, and I'm scared because I'm getting older and my wife's getting older and we haven't had kids, and so I don't have anybody as an heir. And if I go and die right now, if somebody comes and kills me, I'm not going to have anybody to give any of these things to or pass my lineage on more specifically to, so that it becomes very... My dog's knocking on the door right now. It becomes... it was interesting. Forgive me, but I just lost my train of thought. I'll get back onto it. So Abram's really worried about having the child, and God's coming in here in this chapter, and he's saying, in kind of a very high resolution, he's going to give him a child, right? And let's see here. And he's telling him it's not just going to be a child, it's going to be a lot. So he's reassuring him. It's going to be, and this is line 5 of chapter 15. And he brought him forth abroad and said, look now toward heaven and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. So he's saying, hey, look at the stars. How many are there? Can you count them? Exactly. You're not going to be able to count how many children I'm going to give you. Not just children, but grandchildren. That's how many. So it's that unthinkable. So don't fret, right? And it says that he believed in the Lord, so that Abram believed him and continued on. So that this is a little snippet. It was one of his weak points, but it's not breaking him anymore, right? He's not broken by whatever was breaking him before, at least, right? But it's not just about the children. It's about the land. And that's where this chapter gets a little interesting, because it foreshadows what happens to the Jewish people, his children, the seed, in the future, over specifically it says the next 400 years. Right? But they're given the land, but if there's almost like a price to that God's saying, hey, this isn't going to be something that people are going to agree with. Specifically, one nation, it doesn't name them here, will enslave you, right? And this will happen for 400 years. And so he's saying, though, that at the very end here, he's naming all of the different, so we've tried to figure out which of these are the different tribes of Israel, right? Or not Israel, but the different tribes that existed, like who were the Canaanites. Well, it kind of gives us a nice little list here at the very, very end. This might have been most of the tribes in that region at this time. Sounds like was the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaims, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So there's 10 around there? Handful of different tribes essentially that are big and popular. And I believe it was the Perizzites that got in a fight with the Canaanites in that earlier story of Lot and Abram. So that's kind of what we got here in chapter 5. And I think I'm going to move on to chapter 6 too this week, because I don't think there's much more to pull out of that yet, but we might have more that pops out as we move forward in the story. But I do want to, I want to try to fit more than just one chapter sometimes into a weekly episode, because again, the Bible is quite long, and if I don't take bigger bites out of the stories themselves each week, we're going to spend more than a couple of years on the Bible. So, which wouldn't be bad, but I think, like I said, I guess we'll play it intuitively each week. So that's what we've got. We had a little conversation. It's basically showing a little breakdown that he's going through, that Abram's going through, right? So on to chapter 16. Let's see what happens in chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children. And she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. This is a very, very, very important chapter. We're going to spend some time on this one for sure. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife. Again, we'll keep reading. I won't comment too much right here, but Abram and Sarai's relationship is fairly strained, as I'm sure are starting to put together here. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thine hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. So it's an interesting conversation going on here as well, right? And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shall bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. She called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? And wherefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. Okay, so that is, I think, arguably, and we're going to have to spend some time here, not just this week, but next week probably as well, one of the most important chapters in the entire Bible, I think, specifically because of what's going on in the world today with us, right? For us. So I guess we'll let that page just do what it wants to do there. This is the introduction of the intersection of the two of the Abrahamic religions, right? Now, we're going to spend a little time here in a second. And you know what? As a matter of fact, we'll just go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to go ahead and switch over here. Give me 1 second. All right, guys, apologies for any weird changes in noise or anything like that, shaking or anything like that as I get moved around here, because I have a bunch of different cameras going and I am still getting adjusted to my setup. So hope you're liking the view here, but we're going to go ahead and check out Grok for a second here. So let's go to Grok, because I have some things I want to ask about what that chapter we just covered. So before we get into it, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about it, actually. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So we just had a couple of the Abrahamic religions introduced, or one of them, the introduction of its patriarch introduced. So that would be Ishmael, right? And, excuse me, I'm trying to get this mic situated here because I moved around and it's not wanting to adjust right. So Ishmael is the side of the Abrahamic family that ends up producing the lineage of Islam, right? Now this is where the actual family tree splits, right? And this is why I'm sure you can tell as a listener, this is an important part of the Bible for us to spend some time on, right? Because I think it's partially part of the reason why there's so much animosity between the religions, the Abrahamic religions. It can be found in this story, not just this one, but the next one. It looks like probably chapter 16, if I'm remembering right. Has a little bit more detail about why there's bitterness there. But essentially, Sarai does something really weird at the beginning of this chapter, right? Sarai goes to Abram, and this is right after chapter 15, where we have this in-depth conversation, a reiteration of the promise with God, right? God saying, hey, Abraham, I know you're afraid, but I promise you, I'm going to bless you with a son. Now, if I'm not mistaken, it has revealed at this point in the story that Sarai is barren, right? So it is known to both Abram and Sarai that they're not getting pregnant. They're not young people at this point, right? So it's not for lack of trying, essentially. This is why Abram is so desperate, because he's saying, look, Lord, you're saying you're going to give me children, but it's not working. You get what I'm saying? And that's why he's reiterating, no, I promise you, it's going to be more than you can imagine. But it's not just Abram. And so you saw Abram's version of the panic in chapter 15, but now you see Sarai's version of the panic in chapter 16. And it begins at at the start of that chapter, right, with, let's see here, what is it? It says with Sarai, Abram's wife, right? She bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. So she has this idea. She knows that she's not bearing him children. She's nervous that Abram's getting a little bit upset by that, right? And she says to him, or maybe she's just getting self-conscious, right? That she can't fulfill that kind of duty as a wife to her husband in this time. And I'm sure she can see how it's affecting Abraham, right? And so she goes to Abram and says, hey, you can sleep with my handmaid, right? And that's not exactly what you'd expect somebody to say in that situation, probably, right? And it's an odd story to find sitting here in the middle of Genesis, in like the first 20 pages of the Bible, is like this kind of in-depth, somewhat in-depth, really, if you think about it in terms of dynamics, story about relationships. But that the stresses that relationships, things like sex, but money as well, all of these worldly kind of stressors can put on the people we love. And Sarai isn't handling it very well. And one of the ways that she expresses that is through kind of a desperate attempt to get someone pregnant so that Abram can kind of solve this problem. Now, she approaches Abram and says, hey, Abram, I think you should sleep with my handmaid. And the problem with this is Abram being a man, right? He doesn't object very hard, right? So let's read this again so we can demonstrate what I'm talking about here. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So I'm going to double check what hearkened mean, but I'm assuming in that context it's saying that maybe he protested a little bit or didn't protest. I can't tell. We're going to have to tell. I can't tell in that context. Maybe that's a question for Grok. But he didn't do much, at least, because Sarai goes in, the very next line is, and Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. So maybe not immediately after the conversation. It does have like a period of time, it points out here, after 10 years, right? So that could be as well. Maybe it's not exactly right after, but still it doesn't really matter, right? They have this conversation. Abraham hearkens to the voice of Sarai. So either protests or doesn't, one of the two, or agrees. But the next thing that happens is Sarai goes and gets her, and Abram does it, right? So, and Hagar gets pregnant. So then the next thing that happens is, this is so true, right? And I don't mean to be misogynistic or anything like that, right? Because there's funny things about men in here as well. But one of the things that Sarai immediately does after she goes and tells Abram to sleep with Hagar, and it happens, is she gets mad at him for sleeping with Hagar, right? And so it goes to the next slide. It says, hey, why did you do that, essentially? And the reason that Sarai gives is she says, and Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judged between me and thee. So now she's self-conscious, she's saying, essentially. Now I'm worried that she's going to be the mother of your child. You're going to like her more than me, and I'm going to become the handmaid, right? And Abram's saying to Sarai, behold, the maid is in thine hands, right? So you control her future. She's your handmaid. Do with her what you want. So Abram's basically giving back that power to Sarai so that she doesn't kind of lose her mind in that moment, kind of in regret after the decision she just made, right? But this is her version of kind of doubting the word of God. Now, part of the thing that's happening here is there's no angels that have visited Sarai directly. I believe there is one that visits her here fairly soon, if I'm not mistaken, but not at this point. It's partially why she's still called Sarai, right? So she's doubting in this moment, and she's doubting hard, and she's doubting so hard that the solution that comes out of that doubt is one that's arguably pretty not good. It's pretty sinful. You're missing the mark pretty big on that one, right? Because not only are you breaking the vow of the relationship, the covenant that God has made with Abram and you as a corollary, right? Or as a kind of a package deal. But you're also now kind of freaking out at the ramifications and making it worse also, right? So now Hagar, who really hasn't done anything wrong in that sense, it doesn't really say at this point because she's following the direction of her handmaid. So Sarai tells her to do this. And so Hagar does it, obviously, and becomes pregnant. But then it goes on, and these are subtle chapters, right? Let's finish it up again here. And Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth to thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way by shore. So it's giving us location, saying that this is actually something that happened, right? And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence comest thou? So this is interesting because God, or an angel of God, right, shows himself, or itself, to Hagar before Sarai has a visitation, it sounds like, if I'm not mistaken. Abram has had visitations, not Sarai. Hagar has one. And in this visitation, the Lord is doing the same thing with Hagar, saying almost exactly the same conversation. Please don't worry, right? Your child is going to be fine, because she's now starting to get worried that her child's going to be in danger because this crazy lady that told her to sleep with the husband is now jealous of her and wants her gone. And she controls my life and my livelihood and everything like that. So what am I supposed to do? And so the angel's reassuring her that, and then also telling her that it's a very weird chapter. Let's break it down a little bit right here. This couple lines. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, this is line 11, Genesis 16. Genesis 16, line 11. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And this is the weird line 12. And he will be a wild man. What does that mean, right? What does wild man mean? His hand will be against every man. Again, what does that mean? We have to break this down. And every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Right? So is this a bad thing or a good thing? Because there's good aspects to being wild. Free is one of them, right? But obviously there's really bad aspects to having every man against them also. But then dwelling in the presence of all of his brethren. So it's making it sound like you will a large family in this lineage, essentially, right? And so it's God's making another covenant here. It's a different covenant, but God's making another covenant. And this is important because Ishmael, like I said, from what I understand, is the patriarch of the Islamic faith. The original one, right? It is the bloodline of that side of the Abrahamic tradition, right? Is where the Abrahamic tradition split off, actually, is this story specifically. So, the next part is just kind of, so then she goes on and she has Ishmael. So, very important couple chapters there, right? I do want to get a couple questions in here with Grok real quick. So let's do that, and we'll see what we can uncover here, because a couple of these things are kind of confusing. This chapter specifically, chapter 16. Let's see what we can find here. All right. Welcome to Grok. Let's see here. I think the camera's a little bit too far up, actually, but it's okay. We'll adjust it next time. All right, Grok. So I have some questions. not Genesis, Genesis. It's kind of hard to type when the mic's right in front of you like this. Genius, I'm having a hard time. Let's see, 16. And have some... Can you tell me how Ishmael relates to the Islamic faith? All right, so yeah, I'm just wondering how in this chapter, the introduction of Ishmael, like how that character is referenced in the Islamic faith, because we need to start bringing in a little bit of information about that side of the Abrahamic tradition as well. There's a wealth of knowledge on that side as well that I'm not very familiar with, to be completely transparent. I'm more versed in the Christian tradition, right? And I guess some of the Jewish tradition, because it's included in the Bible, the Torah at least, right? The Old Testament. Let's see what Grok has for us. All right. So it says Ishmael, known as Ismail in Arabic, holds, apologies for the mispronunciations if I am, holds significant importance in Islam. Here's how he relates to the Islamic faith. Lineage of prophets. Muslims believe that Ishmael is a prophet and a messenger of God. He is considered the ancestor of several Arab tribes. Okay, so there's a good clarification, including the Quraysh, to which Muhammad, the final prophet in Islam, belonged to. So he is in the lineage of Muhammad. This lineage establishes a direct familial connection between Ishmael and Muhammad, and also Muhammad and Abraham, right? So this is how all of these are connected. The Kaaba. One of the most pivotal roles Ishmael plays in the Islamic tradition is in his association with the construction of the Kaaba in Mecca. Oh, interesting. Again, I didn't know this. I'm learning with you guys as we read this. According to Islamic tradition, Ishmael and his father Ibrahim in Arabic, rebuilt the Kaaba, which is now the holiest site in Islam, towards which Muslims pray. This act symbolizes the unity of monotheism and the submission of God's will. And again, these might be things that are differences between the source texts as well in the religions. I don't know. I'm not familiar, like I said, as much with the Muslim text. We're learning as we go along. But I'm not familiar with the story of Abram building the Kaaba, right? Because I don't think the Kaaba is mentioned. I'm pretty sure it's not mentioned in the Bible. I believe that's specifically an Islamic characteristic or trait of the Islamic faith. Sacrifice and obedience. The story of the near sacrifice of Ishmael by Abraham, which in Islamic tradition contrasts with the Judeo-Christian narrative where Isaac is involved, is seen as a test of the faith and obedience. Okay, Muslims commemorate this event during Eid al-Adha, one of the major Islamic holidays where the sacrifice of an animal represents Ishmael's willingness to submit to God's command. Okay, so this is making more sense now, and I hope it is for you, anybody that's watching. So, Ishmael is one of the fundamental disagreements, it appears, that Muslims have with Christians is over Ishmael. Excuse me, I'm going to adjust this camera here real quick. It's a little bit too far up. There we go. Is over Ishmael, right? And I guess it sounds like, and I was not familiar with this, like apologies for the breaks, the pauses, but Ishmael, Muslims believe that in a later story that we're going to get to here fairly soon in the Bible with Abram, or Abraham in that version of it, that section of it. Spoiler alert, Abraham's future son, Isaac, in the Bible is taken to a mountain upon which God directs Abraham to sacrifice Isaac in a similar fashion to the way that he directed Abraham in that chapter we just read to sacrifice the 3-year-old goat and the 3-year-old, all the animals, right? I don't know if it's a goat specifically, you get the point. So that he's testing Abraham. And again, spoiler alert, Abraham passes that test, but comes very close to actually sacrificing Isaac. Now, apparently, and this is what it sounds like Grok is trying to tell us here, in the Islamic faith, it says right here, The story of the near sacrifice of Ishmael by Abraham is seen as a test of faith and obedience, and it says, which in Islamic tradition contrasts with the Judeo-Christian narrative where Isaac is involved. So I want to ask another question on that, because that's very important here too, another vein we can follow, but let's finish off the answer that Grok has for us. Prophetic role. Ishmael is often cited in the Quran alongside his father, emphasizing his role in the propagation of monotheism. His life is seen as an example of patience, resilience, and submission to God. The Quran mentions Ishmael several times, highlighting the righteousness and prophetic status. Cultural and spiritual significance. Beyond the religious narrative, Ishmael's story in Islam also resonates culturally among Arab and Muslim communities as a symbol of perseverance and divine providence, especially in narratives about the survival in the desert with his mother Hagar, Hajar in Arabic, interesting, where God provided water through the Zamzam well. So that was the well that we just read about, and apparently it's called the Zamzam well. So that's more information. Thank you, Grok. You're just giving us stuff I didn't need to ask about. I was going to probably. In summary, Ishmael is not just a historical or biblical figure in Islam. He is integral to the faith's theology, its rites, and its cultural identity, linking back to the Abrahamic covenant but with unique Islamic interpretations and teachings. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so I have a little bit more that I want to ask there about the sacrifice. So I'm curious about, so if part of so here, I'll just type it. All right, so I ask here, is the disagreement about Ishmael and Isaac's significance the main issue between Muslim and Jewish perspectives? So I'm curious about this. See if there's any other issues, is what I'm trying to find out. What are other key issues between the faiths, if we're not maybe at those parts in the Bible or the books yet? It says, no, the disagreement about Ishmael and Isaac's significance is not the main issue, but Muslim and Jewish perspectives, between them. But it is one aspect of broader theological and historical differences. Here are some key points to understand. Okay, theological differences. Covenant. Jews believe that the covenant God made with Abraham was passed through Isaac, making Jews the chosen people with a special relationship to God in the promised land that we just read about, right? Those covenants that God's making. Muslims, however, see the covenant extending through both Isaac and Ishmael, with Ishmael becoming significant in the lineage leading to Muhammad. Sacrifice narrative. The story of the near sacrifice differs between the traditions. In Judaism, Isaac is the son nearly sacrificed, while in Islam it's Ishmael. This reflects different interpretations of God's test of Abraham's faith. So it's mainly a difference about which of the sons, stemming from this very, very, very fateful decision by Sarai to suggest this, right? So this is, again, an example of what I talked about last week, how maybe Sarai didn't take it seriously enough when they were leaving Egypt, when they recognized that Abram had really screwed up in Egypt. Maybe Sarai didn't understand quite yet how seriously God was taking Abraham, and maybe she didn't know that was why all of that stuff happened in Egypt. Maybe she didn't know it was because of what Abraham did. Maybe she thought it was just because Abraham was being crazy. You don't know, right? Because we're just getting this specific information. But what we can tell is that God takes that relationship seriously, right? And we have an example of it here. He's not messing around, right? As soon as Sarai does something at all doubting what's going to happen in the future for their lineage or anything of God's promises. And these are things that haven't even been said to her. She's supposed to trust what Abram's telling her, God is telling her. So this is like a second, she's not hearing it from the source, right? So it takes a lot of courage and arguably a little bit more faith than it would from even Abram, because she has to believe Abram first, her husband, which is why I think this is a really fundamental story for women in general and for wives everywhere, is because Sarai is being tested here. And it's a story about her not passing every test, just like Abram doesn't pass every test. They both fail in different ways, and the ramifications are great in both. The ramifications of Abram's actions, it suggests in these 2 chapters we just read this week, lead to his generation spending 400 years in slavery in Egypt. It's what it sounds like. At least there's some kind of effect there that happened, right? So, and then Sarai, as soon as she messes up her missteps, the ramifications are the lineage splits that culminates in 2 separate religions that develop over time throughout all of human history, who technically can both agree are related to each other, so they're siblings, but have such serious disagreements on those details about the religions that they're willing to massacre and torture each other all the way up into the modern day, specifically until the modern day. And I include Christians in that too. We're not innocent of this, Catholics specifically, myself included, right? At times and throughout history, religion can be violent, right? But that's why I'm asking these questions to Grok here, right? I'm trying to figure out, I'm actually trying to understand, why are these differences there? Because I didn't know this before, and I hope if you didn't know this, your vision's filled in just a little bit better. Now, I do want to go a little bit deeper here, but I think for now I'm going to pause and leave it there, because we're coming up on time, I think, and I covered a lot of stuff today, right? We will finish up this little part about Grok here before we go, but I don't want to go any deeper into the Bible, because I think next week too, after I get some time to think about this as well, I'm going to have more commentary on this section. I also want to do a little more research myself. So we got the sacrifice narrative, historical and cultural narratives. So the lineage and land, the narrative of who has rightful claim or connection to the land. So this is the one that is happening right now, right? Israel, Palestine varies. Jews see their claim through Isaac and his descendants, while some Muslims view the Arab connection through Ishmael as significant, especially concerning the region's history and control. So both argue that they have right to the land, and this section we just read with God promising Hagar, making a similar covenant with Hagar as God is making with Abram. Although I would argue here before we move forward that it is not the same covenant, and that God is very specifically, in this version, in the Bible version, albeit it would be biased in this argument, right, is very explicitly giving not only the land, but numbering the lineage that will populate that land in, as many as the stars, as much as the sand in the world, kind of all the beaches kind of a thing, right? So countless. So he's being very specific that I'm planning the lineage through you. Then after that, this happens with Sarai and Ishmael. So Ishmael's included in that promise, right? So that covers both the Jewish and the Islamic faiths, which God has fulfilled that covenant, has he not? Those are 2 of the biggest faiths in the world, while Islam is by far, like, leaps and bounds in terms of people, a bigger religion modern day. The Jewish faith is, I think, arguably the most resilient throughout time, and one of the oldest modern day still practicing and popular religions that we have in the world, right? That is still very traditional, that isn't just kind of tribal in essence, right? So fascinating differences there too. The land debate is partially why we went into this a couple weeks ago. This is not a war that's happening in Israel, or in Gaza, specifically in over Palestine, that region, and what it's called, what it's referred to, whether it's Israel or Palestine. This isn't a new debate, and this isn't something that just started in the 1900s or right after World War I, as most people want to talk about. It's much older than that, and those people in those days were having these debates then too, right? Just, we don't remember because we didn't live then. Some of the solutions that came out of that are what we ended up with, this world. Obviously, they didn't work very well. But that being said, it doesn't mean that because the solutions of our recent forefathers failed, that one side or the other is correct. That's too shallow. We have to go deeper in the way we're doing right now and actually figure out what the history is. We'll find out as we read more. Scriptural emphasis, the Torah versus the Quran. The Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, focuses on Isaac as the continuation of the covenant, whereas the Quran acknowledges both sons, but places additional emphasis on Ishmael due to his role in Arab and Islamic identity. Okay, that's very interesting. I didn't know that. So it says the Hebrew Bible focuses on Isaac as the continuation of the covenant, and the Quran acknowledges both sons. So, but it is saying that, yeah, Ishmael is the one that the lineage is passing through directly versus Isaac. So that's the main debate, right? I will say there, just in terms of a balance, that one of the most confusing parts of the story in the Bible, in the Old Testament, is the part we're about to come up to regarding Ishmael and Abram and Isaac and what's done, right, in this upcoming story. It's hard, really, really hard to justify both Abraham's and Sarah's actions. I do think there is a justification that you can find, and you have to look in the same way that we looked at the Egyptian story fairly deeply, but it's there, right? That being said, I do have to kind of give it to, not in the sense of like a match, but Islam in that sense, for at least acknowledging Isaac as Isaac's existence, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, because I didn't expect that necessarily. Identity in modern conflicts. While theological differences are foundational, modern conflicts often revolve around political, national, and ethnic identities rather than solely religious disagreements. Issues like statehood, borders, and rights in the Middle East are more immediate concerns, though sometimes intertwined with religious narratives. Exactly. Grok. Commonalities in dialogue. Both faiths share Abraham as a common patriarch, which has been a point of interfaith dialogue. Efforts are often made to highlight shared values and heritage to foster understanding. So if any of you remember hearing about the Abraham Accords about 4 or 5 years ago, right before Trump got out of office last time, that was the big agreement that Trump's son-in-law ended up kind of working on for his period of time in the White House, and somehow getting through and getting all these Middle Eastern countries to agree to is partially why there is a lot of chaos going on in the Middle East right now, is because that agreement really angered a lot of what's the right way to put it, more tyrannical individuals in the area, right? So that they recognized that if they didn't act within the next 4 or 5, 6 years, the window of opportunity to actually be able to affect change in the Middle East was going to close very rapidly. Why? Because there was an opportunity for peace introduced through the aptly named Abraham Accords. And that's why they named it the Abraham Accords, as we just read, right? Because it is people going all the way back in the history and saying, where's the common link? Well, it's Abraham. It's patriarchy, both share. You're both related to. So why not name it that? Let's go back to when we were brothers. I love that. It's great energy, really symbolic, and it's something that isn't usually explained often enough. While the significance of Ishmael and Isaac does contribute to theological differences, it's more accurate to say this is one layer among many in the complex tapestry of Jewish-Muslim relations. The primary issues might be more related to modern political conflicts, historical grievances, and interpretations of religious texts concerning land, law, and governance. However, understanding these religious narratives is crucial for grasping the depth of cultural, religious identity in these communities. Awesome. So thank you, Grok. That was great. I hope the camera is still working, but if it's not, this one is. That was refreshing, right? And I hope the camera that I was using was still working well. If not, it might have just stopped on me, but that's okay. We got most of the episode down anyway, and I hope you enjoyed it. That's what I got for you this week, guys. I've been working on a lot here this week. To be completely transparent, my brain's a little tired right now. So if you feel me kind of trailing off there at the end, that's partially why. But it's because I'm doing so many other things production-wise to try to get this out to you in a good, as good a format as I can, and to really make it a fun product. So I've been working really hard on it, and because of that, some of my mental energy has gone towards that instead of just enjoying making the episode. So by the end of the episodes of the last couple of weeks, I've been pretty tired. That being said, I'm going to rest up and do some editing on this episode and get it out to you guys and enjoy it myself, see what comes of it. Again, because this chapter is incredibly important, as Grok just kind of highlighted for us. And if you find yourself kind of surprised at any of the information that we uncovered in this episode, in just the relationship between Islam and the Jewish religion and how closely related they are literally, and why that isn't talked about more in common discourse, then you're on the same page as me right now, and we have something to think about over the next week or so. So, that being said, I want to send you a whole lot of love and thank you for being here and supporting the podcast. And I will be back on here next week, at the very least, with another episode of Take Me to Church and the Unfounded podcast. Anyway, lots of love. Bye-bye.